Most people enter the stock market believing investing is about intelligence. They think the smartest investor always wins. They believe success comes from secret formulas, complex charts, perfect timing, or inside knowledge. But after years in the market, many investors discover something surprising. The biggest enemy is not the market itself. It is human behavior. Fear quietly changes decisions during crashes. Greed pushes people into dangerous investments during bull markets. Ego stops investors from admitting mistakes. And hope keeps people holding losing positions for far too long. This is why two investors can read the same information and still make completely different decisions. One investor stays calm during panic. The other sells everything emotionally. One investor thinks long-term. The other chases quick profits. And over time, these small psychological differences create massive differences in wealth. In the little book of behavioral investing, James Montier explains that successful investing is not only about understanding businesses, it is also about understanding yourself. Because markets are driven by people, and people are emotional. Imagine walking into a crowded room during a market crash. Everyone looks nervous. News channels predict disaster. Phones keep ringing with negative updates. Investors begin selling simply because others are selling. Now imagine another investor sitting quietly in the same environment. Instead of reacting emotionally, this investor studies facts calmly, looks at long-term value, and waits patiently before acting. That difference in behavior changes everything. This is where most beginners make mistakes. They spend years learning about stocks but never learn how their own mind works. They do not realize that emotions can quietly destroy even the best investment strategy. This audiobook is about mastering that hidden side of investing. You will learn why smart people make irrational decisions, why crowds become dangerous during market extremes, why confidence can become a trap, and why discipline matters more than prediction. But most importantly, you will learn practical ways to think more clearly when money and emotions collide. Because in investing, the person who controls emotions often controls results. And everything begins during the most dangerous moments of all, the emotional moments when fear and greed take over human thinking completely. So now let us begin with Chapter 1. Chapter 1. In the heat of the moment. Most investment mistakes do not happen when people are calm. They happen during emotional moments, when markets rise quickly. Excitement takes control. When markets crash suddenly. Fear takes control. And in both situations, human beings stop thinking clearly. This chapter explains one of the most important truths in investing. People believe they are rational, but emotions quietly influence almost every financial decision. Imagine an investor opening a stock app early in the morning. The market is falling heavily again. Every headline sounds negative. Experts on television keep warning about disaster. Social media is filled with panic and fear. At first, the investor tries to stay calm, but after watching losses increase day after day, anxiety slowly grows stronger. The investor begins checking prices every few minutes. Sleep becomes difficult. Focus disappears. And finally, the investor sells everything simply to escape emotional pain. A few months later, the market begins recovering strongly, but the investor already locked in losses near the bottom. This situation happens again and again in investing history. This is where most beginners make mistakes. They think successful investing is mainly about intelligence, but emotional control matters just as much. The human brain reacts strongly to financial loss because loss feels personal. It feels threatening, almost like danger. That is why investors often make irrational decisions during stressful periods. Some investors panic and sell good businesses too early. Others become greedy during bull markets and take reckless risks. Both reactions are emotional. Imagine standing inside a crowded theater where someone suddenly screams that there is danger. Even calm people may start running because fear spreads quickly through crowds. Financial markets work in a similar way. When enough people panic together, fear becomes contagious. This chapter explains that markets are heavily influenced by psychology because markets are made of people, and people are emotional creatures. One powerful psychological bias discussed here is loss aversion. Human beings hate losing money far more than they enjoy making money. For example, imagine two investors. The first investor gains $10,000. The second investor loses $10,000. The emotional pain felt by the second investor is usually much stronger than the happiness felt by the first investor. This emotional imbalance changes behavior dramatically. Investors begin avoiding short-term discomfort even when long-term opportunities still exist. This is why some people sell strong investments during temporary market declines. Not because the business became weak, but because emotional pressure became too strong. This is why this matters in real investing. Markets reward patience far more often than emotional reactions. Imagine planting a tree. You cannot dig it up every week to check whether the roots are growing. Constant interference damages growth itself. Investing works similarly. Great businesses often need years to show their full value. But emotional investors rarely stay patient long enough. Another important idea in this chapter is emotional decision-making during market highs. Fear destroys investors during crashes, but greed destroys investors during booms. Imagine a young investor entering the market during a powerful bull run. Every stock seems to rise. Friends keep posting profits online. Financial influencers talk about easy wealth every day. Slowly, the investor stops caring about risk. Research feels unnecessary. Excitement replaces discipline. Soon, the investor begins chasing risky companies without understanding them properly. At first, everything feels wonderful because prices keep rising, but eventually, reality changes. Markets slow down. Speculative investments collapse. And emotional decisions suddenly become painful lessons. This pattern repeats in every generation because human emotions remain similar. Greed during bull markets. Fear during crashes. Hope during losses. Overconfidence during success. The market changes. Human psychology rarely does. This chapter also teaches an important lesson about self-awareness. Most investors believe emotions affect other people more than themselves. But psychology affects everyone. Even professional investors struggle with emotional pressure. The difference is that disciplined investors create systems to reduce emotional mistakes. Some investors limit how often they check portfolios. Some follow strict investing rules. Some keep written journals explaining why they bought certain investments. These habits create emotional distance. Imagine a pilot flying through heavy turbulence. The pilot does not panic and guess randomly. The pilot follows trained systems and procedures. Investors also need systems during emotional storms. A practical lesson from this chapter is simple but powerful. Never make major investment decisions during extreme emotional moments. When panic appears, pause first. Review facts carefully. Think long-term. If you are starting your investing journey today, focus not only on learning about businesses and stocks, also learn about your own emotional reactions. Pay attention to fear. Pay attention to greed. Pay attention to impulsive decisions. Because awareness itself becomes an advantage. Imagine two investors entering the same market crash. One reacts emotionally and sells in panic. The other stays calm and evaluates opportunities carefully. Years later, their financial futures may look completely different because of decisions made during a few emotional weeks. That is the hidden power of psychology in investing. And once investors understand how emotions influence decisions during stressful moments, another major challenge appears immediately: fear of the market itself. Because many investors do not only fear losses, they fear uncertainty, volatility, and the constant movement of prices. So now the next chapter explores a deeper question. Why are human beings naturally afraid of the market? Chapter 2. Who's afraid of the big bad market? For many people, the stock market feels dangerous. Prices move every day. News changes every hour. One moment investors feel confident. The next moment, fear suddenly spreads everywhere. This emotional uncertainty makes many people uncomfortable. Some avoid investing completely because they fear losing money. Others enter the market but panic whenever prices fall temporarily. This chapter explains an important truth. Volatility is normal. Fear is natural, but emotional reactions often create bigger losses than the market itself. Imagine someone standing near the ocean for the first time. The waves look powerful and unpredictable. At first, the movement feels frightening, but experienced sailors understand something beginners do not. Waves are part of the ocean itself. In the same way, market fluctuations are part of investing. Prices rise. Prices fall. That movement never fully disappears. The problem begins when investors expect markets to feel comfortable all the time. When prices drop suddenly, people start imagining worst-case scenarios. Small declines begin feeling permanent. Temporary fear starts looking like long-term disaster. Imagine an investor checking the market during a major financial crisis. Every headline predicts recession. Experts sound worried. Friends begin selling investments rapidly. The investor starts asking emotional questions. What if everything collapses? What if the market never recovers? What if I lose all my money? Fear slowly becomes stronger than logic. But history repeatedly shows that markets often recover long before public fear disappears. This is why disciplined investors think differently during panic. Instead of asking, "How do I escape fear immediately?" they ask, "Has the long-term value truly changed?" That single difference in thinking matters greatly. This chapter also explains that investors naturally focus too much on short-term losses. Human beings feel pain immediately, but rewards slowly. Imagine someone starting a healthy fitness routine. The early workouts feel difficult and uncomfortable. Results take time. Investing works similarly. Long-term wealth usually grows slowly through patience and discipline. But emotional discomfort appears immediately during volatility. This emotional imbalance causes many investors to quit too early. Some people enter the market during exciting bull runs. Everything feels easy when prices rise quickly. Confidence grows fast. But the first serious market decline changes everything. Suddenly, those same investors feel stress and uncertainty. Instead of following long-term plans, they react emotionally. This is where most beginners make mistakes. They confuse temporary price movement with permanent failure. Imagine owning part of a strong business. The business continues selling products. Customers still exist. Cash flow remains healthy. But because stock prices temporarily decline, investors begin acting as if the entire business suddenly became worthless. That emotional overreaction creates opportunity for patient investors. This chapter teaches that market declines are not unusual events. They are part of the investing journey itself. Even great companies experience temporary drops. Even strong economies experience recessions. The key is learning how to respond calmly instead of emotionally. One important psychological concept here is myopic loss aversion. People who constantly monitor short-term results feel more fear because they repeatedly experience small losses emotionally. Imagine weighing yourself every hour while trying to improve fitness. The constant checking would create frustration and anxiety. Many investors behave the same way with portfolios. They open market apps dozens of times daily. Every small decline feels personal. Stress increases unnecessarily. This chapter suggests something powerful. Sometimes checking less helps investors think better. Long-term investing requires long-term thinking, not constant emotional reactions to daily noise. This is why this matters in real investing. The investor who survives emotionally often wins financially. Markets reward patience because most people struggle to remain patient during uncertainty. Imagine a business owner during a temporary economic slowdown. Customers decrease for a few months. Fear spreads in the industry. An emotional owner might panic and shut everything down too early. A disciplined owner studies the situation carefully and adapts patiently. Investors face similar moments regularly. Another important lesson from this chapter is understanding uncertainty. The future is never fully predictable. No investor knows exactly what markets will do next month or next year. Trying to eliminate all uncertainty is impossible. Instead, successful investors learn to live with uncertainty calmly. They focus on probabilities instead of guarantees. They build diversified portfolios. They avoid excessive risk. and they stay prepared emotionally for volatility. Imagine a traveler carrying an umbrella during uncertain weather. The traveler cannot control the rain, but preparation reduces panic. Investors also need preparation instead of prediction. This chapter reminds listeners that fear itself is not the real enemy. Fear is human. The real danger is letting fear completely control decisions, because emotional decisions made during panic often create permanent damage. History shows many examples of this pattern. Investors sell near market bottoms because fear feels unbearable. Then later, they return after prices already recover strongly. Emotion causes them to sell low and buy high repeatedly. Disciplined investors try to reverse this behavior. When fear becomes extreme, they become more thoughtful. When greed becomes extreme, they become more cautious. That emotional balance is difficult, but it creates enormous long-term advantages. If you are beginning your investing journey today, remember this lesson carefully. Temporary volatility does not automatically mean failure. Fear does not always signal danger, and uncomfortable moments often create the best long-term opportunities. Imagine walking through a storm while knowing the sky will eventually clear again. That mindset changes how you experience uncertainty itself. And once investors begin overcoming fear of the market, another psychological challenge quietly appears: optimism. Because after surviving fear, many investors slowly become too confident during good times, and that is exactly where the next chapter begins. Always look on the bright side of life. Chapter 3. Always look on the bright side of life. Human beings naturally prefer positive thinking. Good news feels comfortable. Optimism feels exciting. Hope feels emotionally rewarding. But in investing, too much optimism can quietly become dangerous. This chapter explains how investors often become overly confident during good times. When markets rise continuously, people slowly stop thinking about risk. At first, investors act carefully. They study businesses, they compare valuations, they think about possible dangers. But after long periods of rising prices, emotions begin changing. Confidence slowly turns into certainty, and certainty becomes a trap. Imagine a young investor entering the market during a powerful bull run. Almost every investment seems successful. Social media is filled with stories of fast wealth. Friends talk about huge profits every day. The investor starts believing investing is easy. Research feels less important. Risk feels smaller, and patience disappears because easy money appears everywhere. This is where psychology quietly takes control. People begin assuming recent success will continue forever. They stop imagining negative outcomes. This chapter explains that the human brain loves confirmation. We naturally search for information supporting our beliefs while ignoring uncomfortable facts. This psychological habit is called confirmation bias. Imagine an investor becoming emotionally attached to a technology company. The investor watches interviews praising the company, reads optimistic articles, follows enthusiastic investors online. But warning signs slowly appear. Debt increases. Competition grows stronger. Profits weaken. Still, the investor ignores these problems because the positive story feels emotionally satisfying. This happens constantly in financial markets. Investors often become emotionally loyal to ideas instead of objectively studying reality. This is why this matters in real investing. Markets do not reward emotional attachment. They reward disciplined thinking. Successful investors actively search for reasons they may be wrong. Imagine a detective investigating a difficult case. A careless detective only looks for evidence supporting personal theories. A great detective examines all evidence honestly. Investors need the same mindset. This chapter teaches that skepticism is healthy, not negativity. The goal is not becoming fearful about everything. The goal is remaining realistic even during exciting times. Imagine driving a fast car on an empty highway. Confidence feels natural, but ignoring risk completely would still be dangerous. Bull markets create similar emotional conditions. The longer prices rise, the more people believe risk disappeared. History shows this pattern repeating again and again. During market booms, investors often create stories explaining why high prices are completely justified. They convince themselves old rules no longer matter. At first, the optimism feels harmless, but eventually, excessive confidence creates bubbles. This chapter also explains self-attribution bias. When investments succeed, people often credit personal intelligence. When investments fail, they blame outside circumstances. This creates dangerous overconfidence. Imagine an investor making money during a strong bull market. Instead of recognizing favorable market conditions, the investor believes personal skill alone caused the success. Soon, bigger risks follow. Leverage increases. Speculation grows. Discipline weakens. Then reality changes suddenly. This pattern destroys many investors because success without humility creates emotional blindness. A practical lesson from this chapter is simple but powerful. Whenever you feel extremely confident in markets, pause and ask difficult questions. What risks am I ignoring? What if my assumptions are wrong? Am I studying both positive and negative evidence honestly? These questions protect investors from emotional extremes. If you are investing today, learn to stay balanced during success. Do not let temporary profits convince you that risk disappeared forever. Imagine a skilled mountain climber reaching higher ground successfully. Confidence helps the climb, but overconfidence can create disaster near dangerous edges. Investors face the same psychological danger during strong markets. This chapter reminds us that emotional discipline matters during good times just as much as during crises. Because many investing mistakes are not caused by fear alone. They are caused by excessive optimism. And once investors become too optimistic, they often begin trusting confident experts who appear certain about the future. Chapter 4. Why does anyone listen to these guys? Every day, investors are surrounded by opinions. Television experts predict market crashes. Financial influencers promise huge returns. Analysts recommend stocks with complete confidence. Social media personalities speak as if they know exactly what will happen next. And most people naturally listen to them. Why? Because human beings are attracted to certainty. Confidence feels convincing, even when the confidence is unsupported by reality. This chapter explains one of the biggest psychological mistakes investors make. They confuse confidence with intelligence. Imagine two people discussing the market. The first person speaks calmly and admits uncertainty. The second person speaks dramatically and sounds completely certain about every prediction. Most people trust the second person immediately. But in investing, the loudest voice is not always the wisest voice. Financial markets are complex. Thousands of factors influence prices every day. Economies change constantly. Human emotions shift rapidly. No one can predict the future perfectly. Yet many experts behave as if they can. This creates dangerous emotional influence over investors. Imagine an investor watching financial news during a market correction. One expert predicts a huge collapse. Another predicts massive growth. A third claims a new economic era has begun. The investor becomes emotionally overwhelmed. Instead of thinking independently, the investor starts reacting to every opinion emotionally. This is where most beginners lose clarity. They stop following principles and start following personalities. This chapter explains that media companies also benefit from emotional reactions. Fear keeps viewers watching. Excitement creates attention. Bold predictions generate clicks and conversations. But successful investing rarely depends on dramatic daily predictions. Long-term wealth is usually built quietly through patience and discipline. Imagine a farmer growing crops. The farmer does not dig up the soil every morning because someone on television predicted bad weather. The farmer focuses on long-term process and preparation. Investors also need stable thinking instead of constant, emotional reactions. Another important idea in this chapter is authority bias. People naturally assume experts must know more simply because they appear successful or confident. But expertise does not guarantee accurate predictions. History shows that even famous economists and professional analysts regularly make large mistakes. During major financial crises, many respected experts completely failed to predict what was coming. Yet after the crisis ended, some still spoke with the same confidence as before. This happens because humans rarely punish confident predictions that turn out wrong. Instead, people often remember confidence more than accuracy. This is why this matters in real investing. Blindly following experts can damage independent thinking. Successful investors learn how to think, not simply who to follow. Imagine learning to drive by constantly grabbing another person's steering wheel every few minutes. Eventually, confusion would create danger. Many investors behave similarly when they constantly switch strategies based on outside opinions. This chapter encourages investors to build personal frameworks instead of depending entirely on forecasts from others. That does not mean ignoring intelligent advice. It means thinking critically. Good investors ask questions like, what evidence supports this opinion? What assumptions are being made? What risks are being ignored? These questions create mental discipline. A practical lesson from this chapter is limiting exposure to constant market commentary. Too much noise weakens decision-making. Instead of watching endless predictions, spend more time studying business quality, valuation, financial history, and investor psychology. Because in the long run, strong processes matter more than exciting opinions. Imagine standing in a crowded room where hundreds of people shout different directions at the same time. The loudness alone creates confusion. Modern investing often feels exactly like that. The investor who learns to stay calm and think independently gains a major advantage. This chapter also reminds listeners of something important. Humility matters greatly in investing. The future will always contain uncertainty. No one controls markets completely. No one predicts everything correctly. The smartest investors understand the limits of their own knowledge. And once investors begin questioning expert predictions, they eventually discover another uncomfortable truth. Forecasting itself is deeply unreliable. Because the future rarely behaves according to neat predictions and perfect economic models. And that leads directly into the next chapter. Chapter 5. The Folly of Forecasting. Human beings love predicting the future. Economists predict growth. Analysts predict earnings. Experts predict interest rates. Television commentators predict market crashes and rallies almost every day. Predictions make people feel safe because certainty feels comforting. But this chapter explains a difficult truth. The future is far less predictable than most people want to believe. Imagine planning a long journey months in advance while assuming every road will stay clear forever. Reality never works that way. Unexpected traffic appears. Weather changes suddenly. Accidents happen. New situations emerge without warning. Financial markets behave the same way. Markets are influenced by millions of human decisions. Emotions constantly shift. Economies evolve. Technology changes industries rapidly. Political events reshape expectations overnight. Trying to predict every outcome perfectly becomes nearly impossible. Yet many investors still believe forecasting is the key to success. This chapter explains that forecasting often creates an illusion of control. People feel more confident simply because someone provided a detailed prediction. But detailed predictions are not always accurate predictions. Imagine an expert confidently predicting where the market will be exactly 1 year from today. The explanation sounds intelligent. Charts look convincing. Statistics appear impressive. But reality can change completely because of one unexpected event. A recession, a war, a technological breakthrough, a sudden shift in investor psychology. The future always contains uncertainty. This is where many investors make mistakes. They become emotionally attached to forecasts. When reality changes, instead of adapting calmly, they keep defending old predictions because admitting uncertainty feels uncomfortable. This chapter teaches an important investing principle. Successful investors focus more on probabilities than certainty. Instead of asking, what exactly will happen next year, they ask, what investment offers strong value with reasonable risk today? That mindset changes everything. Imagine a skilled sailor preparing for different weather conditions instead of assuming the ocean will remain calm forever. Preparation matters more than perfect prediction. Investors also need flexibility. Another important concept discussed in this chapter is hindsight bias. After major events happen, people often convince themselves the outcome was obvious all along. For example, after a market crash, many experts claim they predicted it clearly from the beginning. But before the crash happened, very few people acted with certainty. The human brain rewrites memories to make past events appear more predictable than they really were. This creates dangerous overconfidence. Investors start believing they can predict future events more accurately than reality allows. This is why this matters in real investing. Overconfidence increases risk. People borrow too much money, take oversized positions, ignore uncertainty, and believe forecasts are guarantees instead of possibilities. History repeatedly punishes that mindset. Imagine an investor who becomes completely convinced that a certain industry will dominate forever. The investor places most of their money into one popular trend. At first, the strategy works beautifully. Confidence grows stronger. But eventually, market conditions change unexpectedly. Competition increases. Growth slows down. And the once unstoppable trend begins collapsing. The investor was not destroyed by lack of intelligence. The investor was destroyed by certainty. This chapter encourages humility. Great investors understand they cannot predict everything. Instead of pretending certainty exists, they build strategies strong enough to survive uncertainty itself. A practical lesson from this chapter is avoiding extreme confidence in forecasts. No matter how convincing predictions sound, remember that the future remains uncertain. Focus on strong businesses, reasonable valuations, diversification, and long-term thinking. If you are investing today, do not build your entire future around one economic prediction or one market forecast. Build resilience instead. Imagine building a house strong enough to survive changing seasons rather than assuming perfect weather forever. That mindset creates stability. Another valuable lesson from this chapter is emotional flexibility. When facts change, good investors adjust calmly. They do not treat changing opinions as weakness. In fact, the ability to adapt is often a strength. Because markets constantly evolve, and rigid thinking becomes dangerous in uncertain environments. The chapter ultimately reminds listeners of something powerful. Nobody truly knows the future perfectly, and accepting that reality can actually make investors stronger. Because once people stop obsessing over predictions, they begin focusing on what they can actually control: their behavior, their discipline, their patience, and their risk management. And after understanding the limits of forecasting, many investors believe the solution is gathering more information. But the next chapter reveals another surprising truth. Information alone does not guarantee better investing decisions. Chapter 6. Information is not the answer. Modern investors live in a world overflowing with information. Stock prices update every second. Breaking news appears constantly. Economic reports arrive daily. Social media never stops talking about markets. At first, this seems helpful. Most people believe more information automatically leads to better decisions. But this chapter explains a surprising truth. Too much information can actually make investors worse. Imagine standing inside a giant room where hundreds of people speak at the same time. Everyone claims their opinion matters most. Some sound optimistic, others sound terrified. Eventually, the noise becomes exhausting. That is exactly how many investors experience modern financial markets. The real problem is not lack of information. The real problem is how human psychology handles information. Human beings are not perfectly rational machines. Emotions and biases influence how information gets interpreted. Two investors can read the same report and reach completely different conclusions because each person filters information emotionally. This chapter discusses confirmation bias again in greater depth. People naturally search for evidence supporting what they already believe. At the same time, they avoid uncomfortable facts challenging those beliefs. Imagine an investor convinced that a certain company will become the future leader of an industry. The investor spends hours reading positive articles and optimistic predictions. But warning signs get ignored. Debt levels increase. Competition becomes stronger. Profit growth slows down. Still, the investor refuses to change opinions because emotional attachment has already formed. This is where information becomes dangerous instead of useful. Information without clear thinking creates confusion. Imagine someone trying to improve physical health while reading completely different advice every hour. One article recommends one diet, another recommends the opposite. Soon, confusion replaces action. Investors experience the same mental overload. Too much market information often creates anxiety instead of wisdom. This chapter teaches that successful investing is not about knowing everything. It is about focusing on what matters most. Great investors filter noise carefully. They understand that not every headline deserves emotional attention, not every market movement matters, and not every opinion should influence decisions. This is why this matters in real investing. Constant information consumption often increases emotional reactions. Investors begin chasing news instead of following disciplined strategies. Imagine an investor checking market updates every few minutes throughout the day. A negative article creates fear. A positive headline creates excitement. Emotions keep changing constantly. Eventually, decision-making becomes impulsive instead of rational. This chapter also explains recency bias. Human beings naturally give too much importance to recent events. If markets rise strongly for months, people assume growth will continue forever. If markets crash suddenly, people assume disaster will never end. Recent experiences dominate thinking even when long-term history tells a different story. Imagine driving through one heavy storm and then believing every future day will also be filled with storms. Temporary experiences begin shaping permanent beliefs. Investors frequently make this mistake. That is why long-term perspective matters so much. A practical lesson from this chapter is creating mental filters. Instead of consuming endless financial content, focus on high-quality information connected to long-term investing principles. Study business fundamentals. Study valuation. Study human psychology. Avoid reacting emotionally to every headline. Another valuable idea here is creating personal investing rules before emotional situations appear. For example, decide in advance how much risk you will take, how long you plan to hold investments, and what conditions would justify selling. These rules act like emotional protection during stressful periods. Imagine a firefighter entering a dangerous building with training and preparation already in place. Preparation reduces panic. Investors also need systems before volatility arrives. If you are starting your investing journey today, remember this carefully. More information does not automatically create better decisions. Clear thinking matters more. The investor who stays calm and focused often performs better than the investor constantly drowning in noise. This chapter ultimately teaches simplicity. Successful investing does not require reacting to every piece of information in the world. It requires patience, discipline, and the ability to separate signal from noise. Because in modern markets, noise is everywhere. And that leads directly into the next chapter. A chapter about one of the biggest sources of distraction in investing. Financial media itself. Turn off that Bubblevision. Chapter 7. Turn off that Bubblevision. Financial media never sleeps. Every hour brings breaking news. Every market movement becomes urgent. Every small decline sounds dangerous. Every rally sounds historic. The goal is simple. Keep people watching. But this chapter explains that non-stop financial media often damages investor psychology. Imagine waking up every morning and immediately hearing dramatic headlines about markets crashing or soaring before your day even begins. Your emotions already feel unstable. That emotional pressure slowly affects decision-making. Financial television creates the feeling that investors must constantly react, buy quickly, sell immediately, prepare for disaster, chase the next opportunity. But successful long-term investing rarely works that way. Most wealth is built quietly through patience and discipline, not through emotional reactions to daily headlines. Imagine a farmer planting crops. The farmer does not panic every time the wind changes direction for one afternoon. The farmer understands growth takes time. Investors often forget this simple truth. This chapter explains that constant media exposure increases emotional stress, and emotional stress leads to poor decisions. When investors watch market updates all day, every price movement begins feeling important. Temporary volatility starts feeling like permanent danger. This creates anxiety and impulsive behavior. Imagine someone checking their body weight every 30 minutes while trying to become healthy. The constant monitoring would create frustration instead of progress. Investors behave similarly when they constantly refresh portfolio values. This chapter also discusses herd behavior. Human beings naturally follow crowds during uncertainty. When everyone around us becomes excited or afraid, we feel pressure to behave the same way. Financial media amplifies this effect dramatically. During bull markets, excitement spreads everywhere. Stories about easy wealth dominate headlines. People who stay cautious seem foolish. Then during crashes, fear spreads just as quickly. Suddenly, every headline predicts disaster. The emotional environment completely changes. This is where most beginners make mistakes. They allow crowd emotions to shape personal decisions. Instead of thinking independently, they follow public mood swings. Imagine standing in a crowded room where everyone suddenly starts running toward one exit, even without understanding the situation fully. You may feel pressure to run too. Markets create similar emotional pressure. This chapter teaches an important lesson. The market rewards discipline, not constant activity. Many investors confuse action with progress. They believe successful investing requires doing something all the time. But often, the smartest decision is patience. Imagine planting a tree and constantly digging it up to check whether roots are growing. Too much interference damages growth itself. Long-term investing also needs patience and trust in process. This is why this matters in real investing. Financial media focuses on short-term drama because drama captures attention. But long-term investors benefit more from calm thinking than emotional excitement. A practical lesson from this chapter is reducing unnecessary market noise. Limit how often you check financial news. Spend less time reacting to headlines. Spend more time studying timeless investing principles. Read books instead of panic-driven media. Focus on business quality instead of daily price movements. Another useful habit is creating emotional distance from the market. You do not need to react to every prediction. You do not need to follow every trend. And you do not need to constantly compare yourself to others. Imagine a captain guiding a ship through rough weather while ignoring panic from passengers around him. That calm focus creates stability. Investors also need emotional stability during market turbulence. If you are investing today, remember this carefully. The more noise you consume, the harder clear thinking becomes, because emotional media is designed to capture attention, not necessarily improve your investment decisions. And once investors begin reducing outside noise, they start noticing another psychological problem inside themselves: the tendency to ignore uncomfortable truths completely. That leads directly into the next chapter. Chapter 8. See no evil. Hear no evil. One of the biggest psychological weaknesses in investing is the refusal to accept uncomfortable reality. Human beings naturally avoid pain, and admitting mistakes feels painful. This chapter explains how investors often ignore warning signs because the truth threatens their ego and emotions. Imagine an investor buying shares in a company after weeks of excitement and research. At first, everything feels perfect. The future looks bright. Profits appear strong. The investor proudly tells friends about the investment, but months later, problems begin appearing. Sales growth slows down. Debt starts increasing. Competition becomes stronger. Management decisions look questionable. The warning signs are visible. Yet instead of reviewing the investment honestly, the investor keeps searching for hopeful information. Why? Because admitting a mistake feels emotionally uncomfortable. This is where psychology quietly becomes dangerous. People become emotionally attached to investments. Instead of thinking objectively, They begin defending their decisions personally. The investment stops being just a financial choice. It becomes connected to pride and identity. This chapter explains that human beings often filter reality to protect emotional comfort. Imagine someone driving a car while ignoring warning lights on the dashboard because stopping feels inconvenient. Avoiding the problem may feel comfortable temporarily, but eventually the damage becomes much worse. Investors behave similarly when they ignore negative information. This chapter discusses cognitive dissonance. When reality conflicts with existing beliefs, the human brain experiences emotional discomfort. Instead of changing opinions easily, people often reject uncomfortable evidence. Imagine an investor strongly believing a certain technology company will dominate the future, even after profits decline and risks increase. The investor continues saying, "The market just does not understand yet." Sometimes patience is wise, but sometimes emotional attachment blinds judgment completely. This is where most beginners make mistakes. They hold losing investments too long because hope replaces analysis. Hope is emotionally comforting, but investing requires realism. This chapter teaches an important lesson. Successful investors are not always right. Even great investors make mistakes regularly. The real difference is that disciplined investors accept mistakes faster and adapt more quickly. Imagine a skilled ship captain noticing dangerous weather ahead. Instead of refusing reality, the captain changes direction immediately. Flexibility creates survival. Investors also need emotional flexibility. Another important concept here is sunk cost fallacy. People continue supporting bad decisions simply because they already invested time, money, or emotional energy into them. Imagine someone watching a terrible movie for hours only because they already paid for the ticket. Instead of leaving, they continue wasting time trying to justify the earlier decision. Investors often behave the same way. They continue holding weak investments because selling would force them to admit mistakes. But markets do not reward pride. Markets reward rational thinking. This is why this matters in real investing. Protecting ego can destroy wealth. Sometimes the strongest investors are the ones willing to say, "I was wrong." That sentence sounds simple, but emotionally it is very difficult for many people. A practical lesson from this chapter is reviewing investments honestly and regularly. Ask yourself difficult questions. If I did not already own this investment today, would I still buy it now? That one question can reveal emotional attachment very quickly. Another useful habit is separating personal identity from investments. Owning a stock does not make it part of who you are. It is simply a financial decision based on available information. And financial decisions can change when facts change. Imagine a scientist refusing to change conclusions even after new evidence appears. That would not be intelligent science. Investing also requires openness to new evidence. If you are investing today, learn to become emotionally comfortable with being wrong sometimes. Mistakes are part of investing. No investor avoids them completely. The goal is not perfection. The goal is learning and adapting before small mistakes become devastating ones. This chapter ultimately reminds listeners of something powerful. The market does not care about personal opinions. It does not reward stubbornness, and it does not protect emotional comfort. Reality eventually matters. The investors who survive long-term are usually those willing to face uncomfortable truths early instead of avoiding them, and after understanding how investors ignore warning signs. The next chapter explores another dangerous psychological extreme: permanent optimism. Because some investors remain bullish no matter what happens in the market, and that mindset can become just as dangerous as fear itself. Chapter 9. In the land of the Perma bull. Some investors always believe the market will continue rising forever. No matter what happens, they stay optimistic. Bad news gets ignored. Risk gets minimized. Every decline becomes just another buying opportunity in their mind. This chapter explains the danger of permanent optimism in investing. Optimism itself is not the problem. Long-term investing actually requires hope and patience. But blind optimism becomes dangerous when investors stop seeing reality clearly. Imagine driving a car at very high speed while believing accidents only happen to other people. That kind of overconfidence slowly removes caution. Markets create similar behavior during long bull runs. When prices rise year after year, investors start feeling invincible. Easy profits create emotional excitement. People begin believing the good times will never end. This is where risk quietly grows in the background. Imagine a young investor experiencing success during a booming market. Every stock purchased rises quickly. Social media is filled with stories of fast wealth. Friends begin talking about quitting jobs and becoming full-time traders. At first, the investor feels cautious, but slowly, caution disappears. Research becomes less important. Valuation stops mattering. Risk management feels unnecessary. The investor begins believing personal intelligence caused every profit. This chapter explains that long periods of success can create dangerous overconfidence. Human beings naturally assume recent trends will continue forever. When markets rise continuously, people emotionally struggle to imagine serious declines. This is another example of recency bias. Recent success dominates thinking while historical lessons get forgotten. History repeatedly shows this pattern during bubbles. At the peak of excitement, people start saying things like, "The market has changed forever. Traditional rules no longer matter. This industry can only grow." Those statements usually appear near emotional extremes. Imagine attending a massive party that becomes louder and more chaotic every hour. Everyone feels excited. Anyone expressing caution seems negative and boring. Bull markets often create similar emotional environments. This is where most beginners make mistakes. They confuse rising prices with personal skill, but rising markets can make almost everyone appear intelligent temporarily. The true test of discipline comes during difficult periods. This chapter teaches that successful investors remain emotionally balanced during both optimism and fear. They do not become euphoric during bull markets, and they do not become hopeless during crashes. That emotional stability creates long-term advantage. Another important idea discussed here is valuation. During periods of extreme optimism, investors often stop caring whether prices make logical sense. Companies with weak profits receive enormous valuations simply because excitement becomes stronger than analysis. People buy investments because everyone else is buying them. This is herd psychology again. Imagine an auction where emotions become so intense that buyers completely ignore the actual value of the item being sold. Excitement alone drives prices higher and higher. Eventually, reality returns. Markets always reconnect with fundamentals sooner or later. This is why this matters in real investing. Permanent optimism encourages excessive risk-taking. Investors borrow too much money. Concentrate portfolios too heavily. Ignore warning signs. And underestimate uncertainty. Then when conditions change suddenly, the emotional damage becomes severe. A practical lesson from this chapter is learning to stay cautious during periods of extreme enthusiasm. When everyone believes investing is easy, slow down and think carefully. Ask difficult questions. Are expectations becoming unrealistic? Are prices disconnected from business reality? Am I investing logically or emotionally? Those questions create psychological protection. Another valuable habit is studying market history. Every generation believes its market boom is unique, but emotional patterns remain surprisingly similar across time. Greed expands during bull markets. Fear explodes during crashes, and crowds swing emotionally between both extremes repeatedly. Imagine standing outside a crowd and observing behavior calmly instead of emotionally joining the excitement. That mental distance helps investors think more clearly. If you are investing today, remember this carefully. Optimism is useful, but disciplined skepticism is necessary. The goal is not becoming fearful. The goal is staying rational while others become emotionally extreme. Because markets reward independent thinking far more often than crowd psychology. And after understanding the danger of permanent optimism, the next chapter explores another powerful force that influences investors deeply. Stories. Because human beings do not only invest in numbers, they invest in narratives, dreams, and emotional visions about the future. That leads directly into the next chapter. Chapter 10. The Siren Song of Stories. Human beings love stories. Stories create emotion. They create excitement. They help people imagine the future. And in investing, stories can become extremely powerful. This chapter explains that investors are often influenced more by emotional narratives than by objective facts. Imagine hearing about a young founder building a revolutionary company from a small apartment. The vision sounds inspiring. The mission feels exciting. Interviews create emotional connection. Soon, investors stop analyzing the business carefully because the story itself feels convincing. This is where psychology quietly takes over investing decisions. Stories are easier for the brain to remember than numbers and data. That is why exciting narratives spread quickly through markets. People naturally want to believe in transformation, innovation, and huge future success. Sometimes those stories become reality, but many times they do not. The danger begins when investors stop separating dreams from financial reality. Imagine watching a movie trailer filled with dramatic scenes and emotional music. The trailer creates excitement, but the actual movie may still disappoint completely. Markets often behave the same way. A powerful narrative can temporarily push stock prices far above reasonable value. This chapter explains that speculative bubbles often grow through storytelling. New technologies appear. Excitement spreads rapidly. People begin imagining unlimited future growth. Eventually, investors stop asking practical questions. Can this business generate reliable profits? Does the company have strong fundamentals? Is the valuation reasonable? Instead, they simply repeat the story. This is where most beginners make mistakes. They become emotionally attached to exciting possibilities while ignoring present reality. Imagine an investor hearing about a company expected to change the world completely. Every news article sounds optimistic. Social media discussions feel energetic. Friends keep talking about massive future profits. The investor feels pressure to join quickly before missing the opportunity. Fear of missing out becomes stronger than logical analysis. This chapter teaches an important investing principle. A great story does not automatically create a great investment. Sometimes wonderful businesses become terrible investments simply because prices become too extreme. This is why valuation matters. Even the best company in the world can become risky if investors pay unrealistic prices driven by emotional excitement. Imagine buying a beautiful house for 10 times its actual value simply because everyone says it is special. The emotional attraction may feel strong, but price still matters. Investing works the same way. Another important concept in this chapter is narrative bias. Human beings prefer simple explanations and emotionally satisfying stories. Complex reality feels uncomfortable. So investors often create neat stories explaining why certain investments must succeed. But markets are rarely simple. The future contains uncertainty. Competition changes industries. Consumer behavior evolves unexpectedly. Reality is always more complicated than stories make it appear. This is why this matters in real investing. Stories can create emotional blindness. Investors stop thinking critically because they become emotionally connected to the narrative itself. Disciplined investors try to separate emotion from analysis. They ask difficult questions even during exciting market trends. What evidence supports this story? What assumptions are unrealistic? What risks are being ignored? Those questions create balance. A practical lesson from this chapter is learning to slow down whenever an investment story feels overwhelmingly exciting. Strong emotions often reduce clear thinking. Instead of chasing excitement immediately, study the actual business carefully. Examine financial strength. Look at competition, and consider whether expectations already became too optimistic. Imagine a sailor hearing beautiful music near dangerous rocks. The sound feels attractive, but blindly following it creates danger. That is exactly why this chapter is called the Siren Song of Stories. The emotional attraction feels powerful, but disciplined investors must stay aware of hidden risks underneath the narrative. If you are investing today, remember this carefully. Markets reward reality eventually, not excitement alone. Stories may influence prices temporarily, but long-term investing success still depends on business fundamentals and rational thinking. And once investors understand how emotional narratives influence markets, they begin hearing another phrase repeated again and again throughout financial history. This time is different. That phrase has appeared before almost every major bubble in history, and that leads directly into the next chapter. Chapter 11. This time is different. Throughout financial history, one phrase appears again and again during market bubbles. This time is different. Investors say it during periods of extreme optimism. Experts repeat it during powerful bull markets. And crowds believe it when prices continue rising rapidly. The idea sounds comforting. People convince themselves that old rules no longer apply. Risk feels smaller. Valuations seem less important. And permanent growth appears guaranteed. But this chapter explains a timeless truth. Technology changes. Industries evolve. Economies grow. Yet human psychology remains surprisingly similar. Fear, greed, overconfidence, crowd behavior. These emotional patterns repeat generation after generation. Imagine standing inside a booming city during an economic bubble. Luxury spending increases everywhere. People talk constantly about easy money. Speculation becomes normal conversation. Anyone expressing caution gets ignored or mocked. That emotional atmosphere has appeared many times throughout history. This chapter explains that investors often believe recent success proves the world permanently changed. Imagine a market rising strongly for years. New investors enter daily. Every decline recovers quickly. Confidence grows larger and larger. Eventually, people stop imagining serious downside risk. That is when danger quietly grows. This is where most beginners make mistakes. They assume current trends will continue forever simply because recent experience feels powerful emotionally. Human beings naturally project the present into the future. When conditions feel wonderful, people believe they will remain wonderful permanently. But markets move in cycles. Booms create optimism. Optimism creates overconfidence. Overconfidence creates excessive risk. And eventually, reality returns. This pattern repeats across generations because emotions remain deeply human. Imagine a massive party becoming louder and more energetic every hour. People stop thinking carefully because excitement spreads through the crowd emotionally. Market bubbles create similar environments. Investors begin ignoring warning signs because everyone around them appears confident and successful. This chapter also discusses historical amnesia. During periods of strong growth, people forget lessons from previous market crashes and financial bubbles. Older warnings suddenly seem outdated. Caution feels unnecessary. But history matters because human behavior repeats. Imagine a sailor ignoring old maps warning about dangerous rocks simply because modern ships look more advanced. Technology may improve, but the ocean still remains dangerous. Markets behave similarly. Different industries may dominate each generation. New technologies may reshape the economy. But emotional excess still creates bubbles and crashes. This is why this matters in real investing. The belief that normal rules no longer matter often appears near emotional extremes. When investors stop caring about valuation, stop respecting risk, and stop questioning unrealistic expectations, danger increases rapidly. A practical lesson from this chapter is studying financial history carefully. History teaches emotional patterns. You begin noticing how crowd psychology behaves during booms and crashes. You learn how greed expands during bull markets and how fear explodes during downturns. That awareness creates psychological advantage. Another valuable habit is questioning extreme optimism. Whenever people claim risk disappeared permanently, pause and think carefully. Ask yourself, are emotions becoming more powerful than logic? Are expectations becoming unrealistic? Am I following independent analysis or simply following the crowd? These questions protect investors from emotional traps. Imagine climbing a mountain during beautiful weather while still respecting the possibility of storms ahead. That balance creates wisdom. If you are investing today, remember this carefully. Markets change constantly, but human emotions remain deeply consistent, and investors who understand those emotional cycles gain a major long-term advantage. Because the biggest danger during bubbles is not lack of intelligence. It is emotional certainty, the belief that this time truly must be different. And after understanding how investors repeat historical mistakes, the next chapter explores another dangerous psychological trap, success itself. Because sometimes investors make money for the wrong reasons. And that false success can quietly create future disaster. That leads directly into the next chapter. Chapter 12. Right for the wrong reason. One of the most dangerous experiences in investing is making money through bad decisions. At first, this sounds strange. After all, profit feels like success, but this chapter explains an important psychological trap. Sometimes investors succeed not because their strategy was intelligent, but because luck temporarily worked in their favor. And when that happens, false confidence begins growing quietly. Imagine someone entering a casino for the first time and winning several games immediately, instead of recognizing luck. The person begins believing special skill caused the success. Markets create similar illusions constantly. During strong bull markets, even reckless decisions can appear brilliant temporarily. Speculative stocks rise rapidly. Risky companies attract huge attention. Easy profits make investors feel smarter than they really are. This is where psychology becomes dangerous again. People naturally judge decisions by outcomes instead of process. If an investment makes money, they assume the decision was wise. If an investment loses money, they assume the decision was foolish, but reality is more complicated. A smart decision can still produce temporary losses, and a careless decision can sometimes produce temporary profits. Imagine a driver speeding recklessly through traffic and reaching the destination safely. The positive outcome does not suddenly make reckless driving intelligent. Investing works the same way. This chapter teaches that long-term success depends more on disciplined process than short-term results. Great investors focus on making rational decisions consistently. They understand they cannot control every short-term outcome. Imagine a professional athlete following excellent training habits but still losing one match because of unpredictable circumstances. The process remains strong even if one result disappoints. Investors also need long-term perspective. This is where most beginners make mistakes. They confuse luck with skill. After a few successful trades, confidence grows rapidly. Risk-taking increases. Discipline weakens. Soon the investor begins believing losses only happen to other people. This emotional overconfidence eventually becomes dangerous when market conditions change. This chapter explains that bull markets often hide weaknesses in investor behavior. Easy money creates the illusion that careful analysis no longer matters. But when difficult periods arrive, weak strategies become exposed very quickly. Imagine building a house during perfectly calm weather. Structural weaknesses may remain hidden for years. Then one major storm reveals every flaw immediately. Market downturns expose weaknesses in investing discipline the same way. Another important idea discussed here is outcome bias. Human beings naturally focus too much on final results while ignoring how decisions were actually made. For example, an investor may buy a stock based entirely on rumors and emotional excitement. If the stock rises quickly, the investor feels brilliant, but the process itself remained weak and dangerous. Eventually, that behavior often creates painful losses. This is why this matters in real investing. Consistent wealth usually comes from disciplined thinking, not emotional gambling disguised as investing. A practical lesson from this chapter is reviewing your decisions honestly. After every major investment decision, ask yourself important questions. Did I follow a rational process? Did I research properly? Did emotions influence my actions? Or did I simply get lucky? These questions create self-awareness. Another valuable habit is maintaining humility during successful periods. Even great investors experience luck sometimes, and even skilled investors make mistakes regularly. Humility protects investors from excessive confidence. Imagine a sailor respecting the ocean even after years of successful journeys. Confidence matters, but overconfidence creates danger. Investors also need balanced confidence. If you are investing today, Remember this carefully. Making money does not automatically prove your strategy is wise, and temporary losses do not always mean your process is wrong. Focus on decision quality instead of emotional reactions to short-term outcomes, because in the long run, disciplined processes usually outperform emotional behavior. This chapter ultimately reminds listeners of something powerful. The market can reward bad behavior temporarily, but reality eventually catches up. That is why successful investors stay focused on process, patience, risk management, and rational thinking. And after exploring the psychological mistakes investors repeatedly make, the final chapter brings everything together into one practical framework for better investing behavior. A system designed to protect investors from their own emotional weaknesses. That leads directly into the final chapter. Chapter 13. The Behavioral Investor's Checklist. After exploring fear, greed, overconfidence, crowd behavior, and emotional decision-making throughout this book, one final question remains. How can investors protect themselves from their own psychology? This chapter provides the answer. Create systems, create discipline, and follow a checklist before making important investment decisions. Human beings are emotional by nature. Even intelligent investors make mistakes under pressure. That is why successful investing cannot depend only on feelings or intuition. It also requires structure. Imagine a pilot preparing for takeoff. Even after thousands of successful flights, the pilot still follows a checklist carefully. Not because the pilot lacks experience, but because human beings can forget important details during stressful situations. Investors face the same challenge. Fear during crashes, excitement during bull markets, and pressure from crowds can distort clear thinking very quickly. A checklist creates emotional stability during uncertain moments. This chapter explains that successful investing often comes from avoiding major mistakes instead of constantly chasing perfect opportunities. Many investors destroy wealth through emotional reactions, panic selling, overconfidence, excessive risk-taking, or blindly following trends. The behavioral investor tries to slow down and think carefully before acting. Imagine standing at a crossroads during heavy fog. Instead of rushing emotionally in one direction, you pause, study the environment calmly, and follow reliable guidance step by step. That mindset creates better decisions in investing too. This chapter introduces important questions every investor should ask before buying any investment. Am I reacting emotionally right now? Am I following the crowd without independent thinking? Have I studied the risks honestly? Am I ignoring uncomfortable information? Is this investment based on evidence or excitement? Would I still buy this investment if nobody else was talking about it? These simple questions can prevent enormous mistakes. This is where most beginners improve dramatically, not by predicting markets perfectly, but by becoming more self-aware. The chapter also emphasizes the importance of patience. Modern markets encourage constant action. Buy quickly, sell quickly, react instantly. But disciplined investors understand that patience is often a competitive advantage. Imagine planting seeds in a garden. You cannot force growth overnight through stress and constant interference. Healthy growth takes time. Long-term investing works similarly. This chapter reminds listeners that uncertainty never disappears completely. No checklist can guarantee perfect results. No strategy avoids every mistake. But structured thinking reduces emotional damage significantly. Another important lesson here is humility. The market is larger and more unpredictable than any individual investor. Even experienced professionals make errors regularly. Humility keeps investors flexible. It allows them to adapt when facts change. And it protects them from dangerous overconfidence. Imagine a skilled martial artist staying calm and balanced during conflict instead of reacting emotionally with uncontrolled aggression. That emotional control creates strength. Investors also need emotional balance during market volatility. A practical application from this chapter is creating personal investing rules before emotional situations appear. For example, decide how much risk you will accept. Decide how diversified your portfolio should remain. decide how you will react during market crashes, and decide what conditions would justify selling an investment. Preparation reduces emotional panic later. If you are starting your investing journey today, focus not only on learning financial analysis, also learn emotional discipline. Study your reactions during fear and excitement. Notice impulsive decisions, and develop habits that encourage calm thinking. Because in the long run, your psychology may influence returns more than your intelligence. This chapter ultimately delivers the central message of the entire book. The biggest competition in investing is often not other investors. It is yourself. Fear can destroy patience. Greed can destroy discipline. Ego can destroy judgment. And overconfidence can destroy caution. But investors who understand human behavior gain a powerful advantage. Because markets will always fluctuate, crowds will always become emotional, and uncertainty will always exist. Yet disciplined thinking remains timeless. Imagine a calm captain guiding a ship through violent storms while others panic around him. That emotional stability creates survival. And in investing, survival itself becomes a major advantage, because investors who stay rational during emotional extremes are often the ones who build lasting wealth over time.